Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. I'm delighted to see a number of people signing on, even as we're all looking forward to a spring break of some sort next week. So welcome. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Ann Balsamo, and I serve as the Dean of the School of Art, Technology, and Emerging Communication. And I wanted to let you know before we get started that this event is also part of a class in ATEC, and so we will be recording the event. If you don't want to be recorded, obviously you could keep your mic and your camera off. But once we get started, we'll start recording. So David, why don't you go ahead and start the recording, and I'll make our introductions.
We are currently recording.
You are?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, this is a live event, so we're good.
Oh, excellent. Okay. So this presentation is part of the Distinguished Lecture Series corresponding with the Dean's Colloquium for ATEC. The series is called Thinking Forward, From Now to Next. And the intent was to take a moment to kind of regroup after a very unusual, in many cases, very trying year, to now kind of put our heads forward to look at what is possible and what we might kind of recalibrate our attention on as we think about kind of the horizons of coming out of, as I said, a very difficult year. Before I introduce our speaker today, I'd like to introduce our moderators and just describe how this session will unfold. So we have two moderators who will work between questions and comments coming from the audience, and who after the talk will kind of bring those questions forward or those comments to kind of broaden the conversation about the topics that we're going to consider. So let me introduce our two moderators. First, Dr. Kim Knight. Many of you know her. She is actually, among many things, she is the Associate Dean of Graduate Studies in ATEC, and she's also an Associate Professor of Critical Media Studies, and she is also right now also serving as the Area Head of Critical Media Studies. She is also the Director of the Fashioning Circuits Lab. I mean, there's, right, I know what your calendar looks like, and there are many hats that she wears, including being, a scholar and a kind of a maker, kind of at the intersection of technology, kind of critical theory and feminism. Our second moderator today is Mohammed Mizura Rashid, who is a doctoral student in the ATEC PhD program, who is also in the kind of area of critical media studies that are intersecting with technology, and being a kind of, as he just announced, that being at home or grounding himself in the Fashioning Circuits lab. So our two moderators today. Thank you both for kind of being here. And then now let me make an introduction to Dr. Cathy Davidson. And you've seen a blurb kind of about her in the announcement, but I wanted to take just a few seconds to call out some of the honors and the extra institutional leadership that she has done over the past decade, 15 years, that are both kind of grounded in kind of the university as an institution, but has always had as its horizon kind of the broader kind of intellectual culture kind of the United States and beyond. So she has been president, for example, of the American Studies Association and the former editor of the journal American Literature. That is a kind of a disciplinary kind of foundation and base of her training. But she has moved into what can only be described as a very broad kind of set of cross-disciplinary and interdisciplinary head of interest. She was the vice provost for interdisciplinary studies at Duke University. In 2002, when I had the opportunity to really start working with Cathy more closely, along with David Goldberg, she co-founded the virtual organization Haystack, which many of you are familiar with because we were going to host a Haystack conference last year. The organization, Haystack, it stands for Humanities, Arts, Science, and Technology Advanced Collaboratory. That's 2002. It was one of the first kind of virtual distributed kind of organizations that wasn't disciplinary based, but was actually based on a kind of a set of questions and opportunities that were defined as working through or thinking about the future of learning in an information age. That wasn't going to be disciplined in the sense of our disciplinary trainings, but a project that was going to require kind of insight and expertise and commitments from people across disciplines. I was so proud of this moment when in 2010, President Obama nominated her to a 6-year term on the National Council of the Humanities. And she had to be confirmed by the Senate, which happened in July of 2011. I was so proud to know you and to know that your insights and your expertise were being kind of discussed and kind of considered at the highest level of kind of at least the U.S. government. She certainly has served on other field building or kind of, I guess, extensive networks to kind of propagate our responsibility for thinking differently about the future of education. She was on the board of, I think may still be on the board of advisors for the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, their digital media and learning kind of set of portfolio in the book series. And then in 2012, both Dr. Davidson and Dr. Goldberg received the Educators of the Year awards from the World Technology Network in recognition of, and I'm going to read this, doing the innovative work of the greatest likely long-term significance kind of in the field and the broad kind of thinking of education through their work as co-founders of Haystack and the MacArthur Foundation Digital Media and Learning kind of emphasis. In 2016, Professor Davidson was awarded the Ernest L. Boyer Award for significant contributions to American higher education by the New American Colleges and Universities Association. So this has been, I know, a life kind of spanning project to rethink kind of higher education and education at all levels. So it is with great delight that I welcome kind of Professor Cathy Davidson to this virtual ATEC event. So thank you, Cathy, for being here. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for that lovely, lovely introduction, Dean Balsamo. And Anne was there in 2002 when we decided to create this thing called a social network. And it's hard to remember, but not only did Facebook not exist, MySpace did not exist. And at one point we visited, a number of us visited this guy who had a lab in a garage and said, we're interested in like having a display website, but we also would love to have some kind of way that people could interact without it going through an editor. And we know you're doing this wiki thing. Could we maybe set up a wiki? And like a year later, he launched Wikipedia, and that was I'm forgetting his name. You know who I mean. Incredible. And now there are 18,000 members. And sadly, we had to not have our meeting this year, which was supposed to really look at what happens to a social network all those years out. We now some days have 5,000 hackers every morning from the Philippines or Russia trying to get into our site because we're such a well-traveled site, trafficked site. They would like to put fake ads on, not fake, real ads on the site, and they get paid some pittance for doing so. And we've never charged dues. We've never abused data. So at this point, we're at a juncture, and we really have to think through what Haystack will look like in the future. What we built in 2002 is not the world we're living in 2021. And so thank you, Ed, for that lovely introduction. Thank you to Kim Knight and Mohammed Mazna Rashid for being the commentators, tech team, Alan Kazan, Adrian, Tapia, Adam, I can't read my writing, Baxkeeper, and David Budd, who are all going to be helping today to advance my slides as we talk. And I believe right now you all see an entry ticket on the screen. Is that right?
Yes.
Is that yes?
That's a yes.
Okay. Before I even start my talk, 60 seconds, please put your answers in the Q&A. You have just been given the power to create your own university. What 1 or 2 keywords will you emphasize in your mission statement? Just think about the most important keywords for your fantasy university. Please put them in the Q&A. And then we'll see at the end what everybody comes up with. 60 seconds, no more. Don't think about it. Just come up with something on the spot. Does it look like that's enough time for everyone? If so, why don't we go ahead and publish the keywords so everyone can see what the keywords are. Ooh, nice. Truth, inspiration, social justice, food, queer, relationship and collaboration. Not location-based, temporary autonomous zones, technology-experienced educators, real stories from real people, inclusion and hope, imagination, responsibility, tuition-free, yay, institution concerned with social responsibility, abolition, social justice, brave and strong, diverse backgrounds, cross-disciplinary, narrative and history, welcoming, accepting, challenging, exploration. I'm not sure if I've gotten all of them now. But we can now go to the first slide, and I'll talk about this. What I'm going to be talking about today for about the next 40 minutes and then a 20-minute Q&A is what it would look like to remake the university, to redesign the university, to think of this as a moment for redesigning the university. I think programs like ATEC that are already complexly multidisciplinary across domains are our leaders. And I very much look forward to all of the key words that you've put in this wonderful opening exercise being part of the University of the Future. The exercise, I'll be talking more about entry tickets later on. This is one of what's called, Paulo Freire and others talk about this method. It's called an inventory method. It's a method where you don't have to have me saying, yes, calling on you and saying what's right or what's wrong, but you're actually contributing all at once and then seeing the result together and taking that aggregate result and figuring out what we can do with it next. It's a great tactic for running meetings and classrooms. And I love to start every class I teach and most lectures I do with something that automatically says you as an audience member are more than a listener. You are an active participant in this endeavor. And that's basically the futures of higher education I'm going to be talking about today. Next slide, please. This talk is dedicated to our students, and I thank you all. I know there are many students who are watching today. Thank you all for inspiring us to reimagine the future. Failure is not an option. Pessimism is not an option. We have to take a situation that wasn't great before a pandemic, and hopefully by the time the pandemic is over, we will have seen and thought about our values in deep ways and can help to make a better future. Next slide, please. I always like to remind people that this is by no means the first time we've all been learning remotely. And this is a hilarious slide from Chicago, where I was born, in fact, not in 1937, but where they were doing broadcasted radio school lessons because of the polio epidemic, an epidemic that pretty much ended during my own lifetime later on after World War II because of a vaccine. And hopefully the current pandemic will also come to an abrupt end thanks to this new vaccine. Next slide, please. I'm going to start with two epigraphs. The first comes from the great writer Arundhati Roy. The pandemic is a portal. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our databanks, and our dead ideas, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. I mean, if that's the choice, I know which choice I want. Next slide, please. And then a very different epigraph. The lecture is the pedagogical equivalent of bloodletting. This is a statement by Carl Wyman, who is the 2001 Nobel Prize laureate in physics. He holds positions as a professor of physics and education at Stanford. I was fortunate twice. I've been invited to be on the Nobel Prize Committee's forum on the future of education, and this year we were on a panel together where he came away with this statement that the lecture is the pedagogical equivalent of bloodletting. What he means by that is bloodletting was used for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then suddenly the medical profession realized that it wasn't efficacious, and in fact it was dangerous, and had to quit. It took about 50 years after that realization, after everyone knew bloodletting was dangerous, to actually get rid of bloodletting as a practice. He's convinced that we're right now at that moment, that we're in the moment where we know the lecture doesn't work. We've had over 1,000 studies on the efficacy of active, participatory, engaged learning versus one-way passive lecture, either a straightforward lecture or what I call the distributed lecture, which is the typical classroom discussion where one person's still at the front, still controlling the debate, still asking the questions, and the three students most confident to raise their hand fill in the question, but the lecture still, the distributed lecture continues. He thinks we're on the verge of something very, very different. I'm sure with all of the artists and designers who are part of this meeting today, you have many ideas to offer about new ways that we can transform our classrooms and get rid of this bloodletting. Next slide, please. Part one. Before we do the future, I want to do a brief steeplechase through some history. I feel like history teaches us that people made the institutions that tyrannize us. And that means we can unmake those institutions for our own and our students and our colleagues' liberation. Next slide, please. The great project of the 19th century is to turn farmers into factory workers. If you read any accounts of 19th century education, mandatory public education, they're all about training people who have made decisions for themselves to stop making decisions for themselves, to give up their intellect to somebody else, the shop foreman, who's going to tell them what to do, when to do it, how often to do it, on a regular clock-based mechanized system. No farmer, no rancher works that way. You're constantly making decisions based on the changes in the weather, whether it's raining or snowing or too hot one day, on incidents that you have no control over. Your horse is tangled up in a barbed wire fence and you have to put away your idea that you're going to fix the fence because your horse is bleeding. You're going to lose your horse if you don't attend to that horse first. So you're constantly in a situation where your intelligence is your survival. Your decision making and problem solving is your survival. That's a disaster on the assembly line. So everything about 19th century education is about regularity, standardization, uniformity, and time. The school bell becomes the symbol of 19th century compulsory education. Why? Because you're training people. They can't just wander in from the field. They have to be there at a certain time or they will be penalized. Next slide, please. For higher education, there's a different problem. Who's going to manage all of these factory workers? How do you make a professional managerial class? What is the apparatus of a new professional managerial class? Scientific labor management theory is inventing a whole apparatus of measurement, that's about the professional managerial class: statistics, bell curves, eugenics, standard deviation, assembly lines, punch clocks, mass production, standardization, production and efficiency quotas, quality control, specialized division of labor, scientific study of productivity from hourly wage labor, to use Marx's term. Meanwhile, higher education between 1860 and 1925 goes through a massive change, both in Europe and then imported to the United States and then imported to the world, exported to the world, where everything becomes standardized, measured, mass-produced, with efficiency quotas that are very, very much influenced by Taylorism, Fordism, and the assembly line. I'm just going to read this crazy slide where I like to throw in everything I find from this time period. Not only do we have mandatory public secondary schooling, but we also have university teachers setting the K through 12 curricular requirements. We create research universities, public universities, land-grant universities, historically Black colleges and universities, junior colleges, majors, minors, electives, divisions, certification, graduate school, collegiate law school, nursing school, graduate school of education, collegiate business school, mandated contact hours, degree requirements, Carnegie credit hours, grades, IQ tests, giftedness, learning disabilities, multiple choice tests, college entrance exams, SATs, tenure sabbaticals, faculty pensions, peer reviews, school rankings, donor name chairs, corporate sponsorship of research, adolescents, crits and thesis defenses, and failure. These are things that as an educational apparatus either didn't exist or were not institutionalized before 1860. They're fully institutionalized in place by 1925, and there's not a single one of them on that list that I have to define for anybody in 2021. That's kind of astonishing that this is the infrastructure of our lives in higher education, fully in place by 1925. The ones in red are ones I love to talk about because they're insane when you think about them, but they determine so much of our life as educators. Next slide, please. The first school in America that goes from recursive, written out, long comments and one-to-one discussion between teacher and students to something that was considered scientific is Mount Holyoke College in 1898. Mount Holyoke wanted to train the new modern woman, so it used Taylorism to invent a system where you take all of the different ways people learn and you reduce all of them to one simple scientific grade, A, B, C, D. Whoops, that's a problem, right? When I wrote a book called Now You See It about cognitive neuroscience in 2011, I did archival research on the debates about Mount Holyoke's invention of grading. And the big debate was, what do we do about the E? My God, if we put an E on someone's transcript, someone might think it's excellent instead of failure. So we can't do that. So let's just skip the E and go to the F. Think about it. A, B, C, D are non-referential grades. They don't stand for anything. F stands for failure. Within 1 year after Mount Holyoke adopting the F, A, B, C, D, and the F, there's a whole new psychology of failure. Who is a failure? Of course, it's women who fail at math, and it's people of color who fail at higher education. It's immigrants who fail at higher education. It's non-English speakers who fail at higher education. It's a whole system of what determines failures that's bound up with the eugenics movement of the time, bound up with the whole science of labeling who can and cannot succeed. The second institution in America that adopts ABCD, they don't adopt the F. ABCD grading is the American Meatpackers Association. And when I wrote Now You See It in 2011, I interviewed people from the American Meatpackers Association. And to this day, every piece of meat has a grade on it. But unlike your school transcript, the grade on a piece of meat is considered only a sign of, in fact, metadata that exists behind the grade. You can find any piece of meat and find out who gave the grade, what kinds of grades they give, the range of grades they give, and the written, discursive, good old 19th century comments about the meat. When you go back to the early Meatpackers Association debates, they don't care about an F for failure. If somebody's a failure, it shouldn't be graded, it should be discarded. So they're only concerned, actually mostly with ABC grades, and everything else gets thrown out. But what they're really concerned is, how do you take something as complex as sirloin and chuck and reduce it to something as simplistic as an ABCD grade, right? That is not in the discussions among the educators. that are adopting this. It's very salutary to think about that, and humbling to think about it. Needless to say, there's a group of progressive educators, including Maria Montessori and Dewey, who are fighting this vehemently. But among those who think of themselves as the beginnings, the founders of a new modern education system, it's just fine to reduce all of those interactions to an A, B, C, D, or F grade. Next slide, please. Lonnie Guinier calls this whole apparatus of testing the tyranny of meritocracy. Sylvia Wynter calls it the mathematics of inequality. And it's bell curves that are bound up with eugenics. Sir Francis Galton, who invented the bell curve, also had a proposal before Parliament, he was British, of course, saying that aristocrats should be paid to reproduce and working class people should be forcibly and legally sterilized. He was a total believer in eugenics. IQ tests have a similar history. The IQ test, as you may know, was used to determine who in the United States would go to the front in World War I and who would have a safer position as an officer or at least behind the lines. Ethnicity was key. It was written in English. So if you were an immigrant, of course you were cannon fodder and sent to the front. You didn't understand the question. It was also incredibly value laden. This funny drawing to the left is an actual test, an IQ test that was given to American servicemen. What you were supposed to decide from this picture was who was prettier. That is what determined whether you were going to live or die in one of the, I think maybe the bloodiest world of all the world wars. Somebody who knows military history can confirm that, but I believe it had the highest death ranking of all the world wars. Candace silent reading test, ABCD multiple choice test, invented to test, I'm quoting, it's not a phrase I would ever use, lower order thinking of the lower orders. It was when compulsory high school was required and immigrants were coming into the cities. There weren't enough teachers. So this was a way of automating who could grade. You took an answer sheet and you put it over the grade so anybody who didn't need an education could grade exams. It was considered an expediency. By 1925, it becomes the SATs, which becomes the way of deciding who gets into college or not. This year with the pandemic, where they've had to not have the SATs, we've found this incredible inequality of standardized testing. More people are applying to colleges and getting in than to elite colleges than ever before because the SATs are so much about measuring your economic background and the kind of preparation you've had. Next slide, please. It's not just who is prettier among standardized testing, among grades, it's also Charles Eliot, who invented so many of those things at Harvard, also creates the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, the first accrediting, credentialing, ranking system in the United States, the one upon which all of the others are based. It doesn't matter if you're Harvard. Well, it does. Harvard is number one, and that becomes the standard against which everyone else is ranked, who is prettier. You could be a land-grant university, a state university, an HBCU. There's an arts college, I believe the last picture is Cooper Union in New York. You're still having systems of ranking that basically have a genealogy that goes back to the richest, most elite university in the country. Who is prettier? Next slide, please. And it's not just our institutions, it's us. At the same time period, virtually every professional association in America gets established to decide what are the scientific, hardcore, indelible standards for success, promotion, tenure, peer review among our professions. It's a constantly self-reifying system of who is prettier. Next slide, please. That's what we're up against. Where are we now? Next slide, please. So now it's actually pretty old. Now it's 18 years old now. Goes back to April 22nd, 1993. That was the day two professors from the University of Illinois, Larry Smarr and Dan Reed, came out and held up on national television a piece of paper. And what they did was they said, we are going to give the world the greatest, almost unimaginable gift. We're going to give you the Mosaic 1.0 browser. So from your computer at home, you will have access to all the world's knowledge, to every website in the world, to all of these websites. And literally every website in the world on April 22nd, 1993 was typed out on one piece of notebook paper. There were at that time 26 of them. But it was amazing because it was a way you could communicate to anybody else who had an internet connection without a pause or a delete button, without identity or verification. You could pretend everybody had goofy names. I think I'm still Cat in the Stack from 1993. Without an editor or expertise of any kind, you could lie because there was also no one to check you, no one to say your data was wrong, and no one also really to think about security or privacy, issues that have become much bigger, shall we say, since 1993. Next slide, please. So we're living in this post-1993 world where we went from 26 to 10,000 websites by the end of 1993, where computer use increased by 2,500% between April 22nd and January 1st, 1994. It's now 18 years later, but we're still asking questions. We're still deciding who gets into college by the metrics, not even of 1993, but of the metrics of 1925, right? Educators use the term sequestered problem solving for the most typical kind of learning we do in schools, which is to say, not how to learn, but how you can memorize the content, regurgitate it back on a test, unaided by any other source, right? You're in a sequestered room. You have to use your own brain to answer a question. Where else do we do that? Where in the world do we think of, right? You can't have anything these days without somebody pulling out their smartphone and testing, Googling it, searching to find out if it's right or not. But we have a system of education based on the sequestered knowledge you put forward on an SAT and the sequestered problem solving on final exams. Your life is dependent on unaided sequestered problem solving in an era of such abundant information. Nobody knows what to do with the world we live in now. That's crazy. That is an incredible mismatch between the methods we have, the methods we've inherited, the methods designed between 1860 and 1925, and the world we live in 2021. Next slide, please. Who goes to school has also changed, right? Now, approximately 40% of all Americans attend some form of higher education. In other countries, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Great Britain, it's more like 60% go on to higher education. In Eliot's day, it was about 4%, right? And it was almost, certainly at Harvard, it was white, elite, men. The women weren't allowed at Harvard, right? And it was, there were a few people of color. Most famously, Charles Eliot was enamored of W.E.B. Du Bois and in a very racist letter supported Du Bois's fellowship to go to Germany. But he did admit him to Harvard. He was the exception. But in general, it was a very elite world. Our students now are what my friend Gail Mello, who used to be the president of LaGuardia Community College, says our job now is not to teach the elite, but to teach the top 100%, which is a lot harder, right? To take every student where they are, and our job shouldn't be to say who is prettier. Do you measure up to some student at Harvard? But to say, how can you learn to be better at what you're doing than now? How can you make a better future? How can we give you the tools to make your own future better? To do those things that all of you put in the key words that you did at the beginning of this talk. How can we do that? How can we do that for 18 million undergraduates? Over 40% now who are at community college. Over 40% of whom work at least 30 hours a week while they were going to school. That's not Charles Eliot's world. That is not the world of Harvard in 1900. 25% of students today work full-time while they're going to school full-time, and most of our scholarship systems, we can talk about this in the Q&A, I don't know what it is in Texas. In New York, you lose your scholarship if you're not full-time. That's a terribly punitive system, that you have to be a full-time student, even if you're working full-time. My God, that's just unbelievable. 30% of students today are first-generation college students, 24% low income, 25% facing food and housing insecurity, 58% female, 45% students of color. 0.4% of students go to the Ivies Plus. Schools like the one I taught at for many years, Duke University, very different from the school I teach at now, City University of New York, the nation's largest public urban university. But I think 99% of the books and articles about higher education are based on that 0.4% that go to the Ivies Plus. still a very inequitable system that I think we can change with those keywords you've put already in the Q&A feature. I think those are the words that have to shape the university of the future. Next slide, please. Our students are not homogenous, but most of our technology is, right? I mean, our students don't look like the Brady Bunch, but when we're on screens, we're all in these symmetrical little boxes, right? My own program, the Futures Initiative at CUNY, is now talking about how we used to have, when we would meet face-to-face, we would always have a check-in. And if someone didn't feel like checking in, you could tell from their body language, and nobody bugged them. No one was forced to check in. Now, when you're on a screen, you either have to be there in your little box and make a performance for everybody, or you have to check out in the most binaristic way, either your name with a white name on a black screen, or check out in some other way. It's a very, very unidirectional system. What we try to do is come up with crazy ways to break through the anonymity and uniformity and standardization of the screen. This one, we all took a break, and when we came back, I said, okay, when we come back after our break, wear a goofy hat. And if you don't have a hat, put a sock on your head, do something. So it was silly, but it also was a way of just saying, we're walking, we're being creative, we're being interesting. I never make students put on their cameras because I think it's a terrible invasion of privacy. On the other hand, it's horrible to look at screens that just have black squares with a white name on them. So I have students put up some kind of an avatar on their screen. And often when we take a break, I'll ask a student to set a task for us. One time a student said, come back wearing your clothes inside out. That way we know we're not disadvantaging anyone who doesn't have any other clothes to wear. Just wear your clothes inside out. Or make something goofy. Find any kind of refuse around your apartment and make something goofy and come back with something goofy. Or draw something. What I've found every time we do this, and we do this in every class period, is some student who would not be the class star suddenly turns out to have this incredibly creative talent, and everybody goes crazy. Everyone's like, whoa, you know, Anne, who knew that you would come up with that? That's amazing. How did you do that? And suddenly they learn a talent they did not know that was recognizable, that counted, because in A, B, C, D, F culture, it didn't count. It was invisible. Next slide, please. Part 3, how are we going to change this incredibly hierarchical, top-down, one-way, standardized, automated system that was designed to teach farmers how to be factory workers and to train a professional managerial class to keep those factory workers in line? The first thing we have to do, the first step, is we have to imagine a more equitable system. That's not easy, but it's possible. Next slide, please. At Haystack and now at the Futures Initiative, we have an adage that I love to quote. We cannot change structural inequality with goodwill. We must design new structures with equality designed at the core. We've been doing critical race and gender theory in higher education for at least 4 decades, and the stratification of higher education is a little different than it was, but not significantly than it was 40 years ago. We still have a situation where the ways we teach, the ways we select students, replicates us as professors. And since most of us are white from family backgrounds with some interest in education, we often replicate ourselves. And in fact, I heard a lecture by Thomas Piketty, the economist Thomas Piketty, on Monday, where he said, right now, the biggest metric for inequality, not social mobility, but social inequality, is higher education. Higher education has become the engine, not of social mobility, but of promoting social inequality. We have to change that, and we have to really think about our structures if we're going to change that, because all of our structures are about who is prettier, about inequality. Next slide, please. Thank you so much, Alan, for advancing these slides for me. Thank you. The first thing we have to do is change the inequality of the teaching profession itself. Charles Eliot created the first school of education and overtly and explicitly did not include higher education in the school of education. It was for improving normal school, making sure the teachers of primary and secondary school did a better job teaching. So what did they learn? Pedagogical methods, research on memory and cognition and retention, methods of creativity, methods of understanding the social conditions from which students came and adapting education to those social conditions. Meanwhile, Eliot said, no, college teachers shouldn't learn those things because you go to graduate school to learn how to do research. And all that counts is how well you do research. So our reward system rewards research on top, sort of teaching, although often if you're too good at teaching, it can be held against you. And then service is despised, right? We know how badly our society teaches service workers. So the people who do the committees, instead of being the ones who are responsible for transforming our institutions, have the least status and are often women and people of color who are in those roles. What we need to do is make a more egalitarian system that rebalances research, teaching, and institutional leadership. I think we have to get rid of service as a term and call it institutional leadership. If you're changing the curriculum of your school, you are an institutional leader. You're doing a management task far more difficult than most managers in corporate world because you can't fire anyone, right? You're dealing with faculty members who can't be fired. That is a management challenge for you. I've been working with a number of administrators. None of them want to be named because they're afraid of how inflammatory this could be, of either a 3 or a 5 year plan that faculty could make with their administrators where they said, for the next 3 years, I want my rewards as a faculty member to only be based on one of the 3. I'm going to be doing research like crazy and I'm going to get my book out. And if not, you can penalize me in any way you have to penalize me. But I'm not going to be doing institutional leadership and I'm going to be teaching the courses I have been teaching. I'll do a responsible job, but that's not where my energy is. I want to be judged by research, or I want to be judged by teaching. I don't know anything about memory and cognition. I don't know anything about pedagogy. I want to spend the next 3 years really learning how to be a master teacher, reading the research and using it in my classes, trying it out, being serious about it. And I want that to count as the way research counts now, or institutional leadership. Our university sucks. We're stuck in a rut. I want to change that, but I'm not going to do that in a way that hurts my career. I want to get credit for it. So we're talking about contract, a different kind of labor contract that would allow you to portion out what part of the triad you want to emphasize. We'll see how it goes. We're in the middle of doing this now with a number of university presidents and provosts and deans. Next slide, please. But until we change how faculty rewards change, institutions aren't going to change. Teaching. The standard ways of teaching now are lecture, or what I call the distributed lecture discussion, which are always one-to-many. What happens when we break that apart? So instead of one-to-many, we have many-to-many discussions. Students are taking ideas. Maybe they've read the work before class. That's the standard flipped classroom. They've read the work, read the problems before, and they're working those through together before a professor weighs in. What we did at the beginning of this lecture, where you all put things on the Q&A without knowing what anyone else was writing and without knowing what I thought was the right answer, that's an example of many-to-many communication, where we all find out at once what the ideas are. When I taught at Duke, the head of Cisco, the huge Cisco conglomerate, was on our board of trustees, and he was so impressed when I did a many-to-many inventory exercise for the board. He had me come and do it with his top performing 100 CEOs. Bill Clinton was the other person who was orchestrating that event. So that gives you some. It was the head of Deutsche Bank. It was the head of Sony. I mean, and we were doing many-to-many forms of communication because, as John Chambers said to me, there's no one more passive than a CEO when their bigger CEO is in the room, right? So many-to-many communication is an incredible way to get an inventory of all the ideas in the room so you can be as creative and productive and innovative as possible. And until you get out of that, one-to-many still means you're sending your ideas through an editor, through the teacher, through the professor, through the CEO, who's going to sort and tell you what is or what isn't a good idea, what counts, what's the right answer, and then everybody else very quickly aligns to that answer. Whatever they were going to say, they quickly either align to that answer or the other one. And we all know that person who stands up after a talk and says, well, it's not really a question, it's a comment, and who makes the opposite comment. Right? Because it's so structured as a binary that there doesn't seem to be other choices. There aren't all these brave and strong, diverse backgrounds, exploration, these amazing things that you all wrote in the chat when you didn't know what the standard was or the ideas were. You were just writing what you were thinking. Next slide, please. Right now, we're in a moment where everybody's talking about decolonizing museums, higher education, artificial intelligence, and what I'm going to focus on in the last part of this talk is how we decolonize our own classroom. I'm going to be talking about a number of people that are doing things to decolonize the classroom, and then I'm going to do some actual exercises, and we'll do another inventory exercise at the end using the Q&A feature. Next slide, please. Ellen D'Souza has a wonderful book called How Art Can Be Thought, which is about a handbook for changing the classroom. And he says a demographically homogeneous faculty group can easily function under the delusion that they have attained their positions because they are the best ones for and in those positions, rather than considering that they have attained those positions because others have been systematically eliminated before they can even be contenders. That's what SATs do. You've probably seen this done. I've seen it done many times now where someone will put up a map of SAT scores, the map of the United States showing the distribution of high SAT scores, take down the map and they put up a map of distribution of high income across the United States. You can't tell the maps apart. They're virtually the same maps. If we were being honest about it, we should just say, okay, let the richest people go to Harvard, second richest people go to Yale. We've got a ranking system. Just take the richest people and put them in the highest ranked universities. Of course, we don't want to do that. But what we're doing is very much the tyranny of meritocracy, as Delany says, the mathematics of inequality, as Sylvia Wynter says, in order to give ourselves the idea of a meritocracy, when in fact, the top 10% of Americans are 50 times more likely to go to college than the bottom 10%. Not because of worth, but because of educational background, income, all of those factors. Next slide, please. Decolonizing K-12. This is a crowdsourced project by K-12 art teachers. It's amazing. It's an amazing resource. I highly recommend you look at it. It looks at color, at values, at safe spaces, at form, at the line. The racism of the line, what was considered by modernism to be scientific, the line that was so Western, even when it was borrowed from Algiers or Mexico, as we're now finding out from Picasso spending so much time in Africa or others spending time in Latin America. The textures, the shapes, it's an incredible resource for K-12 teachers. And of course, we're not going to just decolonize art school, higher education art school, unless we also start earlier. So people see in a different way, which is something that's happening everywhere right now, in our museums especially. Next slide, please. Old friends, actually John Seeley Brown was one of the people with Anne and David Thiel Goldberg and I who helped create Haystack in 2002. He's was head of Park Xerox, where Anne also was a researcher for many years, a computer scientist, engineer. He and Ann Pendleton Julian have an incredible book called Design Unbound, Designing for Emergence in a Whitewater World. And they say architectural design is about creating new context to inhabit, not just creating buildings, but in creating new context to inhabit. Anne gives a seminar every year at the Red House, an experimental innovative house at Georgetown University that's directed by Randall Bass. And Randall Bass takes their concept and applies it to higher education, asks two questions. What forms of higher education are possible now? And then he ups the ante. What forms of higher education are only possible now? That's an incredible challenge to think about if we're redesigning higher education. Next slide, please. Oh, the art crit. Talk about a Hunger Games death match, competition to the finish of so much of our most creative people. The great historian Nell Painter retired from Princeton University, having won so many awards as a historian, and decided to get an MFA at RISD and wrote a book called Olden Art School, which was all about how she completely lost any ability to do art from going to RISD because she felt like she had no talent whatsoever. But she didn't just lose her talent. This famous retired Princeton professor who'd won National Book Awards and everything else felt she was worthless, having gone through the crit. Felicia Rose Chavez in the anti-racist writing workshop, How to Decolonize the Creative Classroom, has new questions to ask at the art crit. She calls it discovery-based crit, and it's very different than the normal slash and burn kind of crit. I use that because I once was in an art class where our teacher would come around to our final art prep projects with a little jar of paint and a paintbrush and would do this and literally make an X through our canvases. Very different. Who were you when you began this journey? What an amazing question. What did you set out to do and why? Where are you currently in your practice? What's next? Those are those are not easy, those aren't softball questions. Those aren't easy questions. I know your most recent speaker was Bruce Mao. I had to turn and look. And he has a wonderful exercise called the 3-minute manifesto, where he has people write a manifesto about their future, 3 minutes, and people know their future. And they're always surprised they can write their future in 3 minutes. And then he says, the reason you didn't know you could write your future in 3 minutes is no one asked you. Wow, right? If you're going to design new education, really redesign it, we have to ask those questions, including what's next. Next slide, please. Sarah Hendren is a wonderful professor at Olin College, which is the nation's only liberal arts engineering college, who has a book called What Can a Body Do? How We Meet the Built World. And I love it that this book is designed where the words are crammed off the page. Sarah also invented this redo of that horrible old person in a wheelchair who looked like they were in the electric chair, not a wheelchair. They were fixed, and she turned it into a race. And she emphasized that building is both a noun and a verb. In her art design practice with people with disabilities, the people with disabilities lead the practice. There's never just engineers in the room. There's never just artists in the room. There's users and practitioners as well as engineers and artists. And sometimes there's artists and engineers who have disabilities, because as she says, it's a matter of time before we're all disabled, right? The activist disabilities term for able-bodied people is TABs, temporarily able-bodied, right? And that's a wonderful thing to think about as we look at our built and building world and think about building a new world. Next slide, please. Algorithms of Oppression, a wonderful book by Safiya Mojo-Noble that began when she was in library school, thinking about categorizations, and she looked up Black women, and the first 100 or so things that came up in search were like erotic, pornographic, subjugated, demeaning, demoralizing terms. She happened to be a haystack scholar when she was in graduate school, and she wrote us and said, wow, my library school doesn't see that anything about algorithms and racism and algorithms and in search function has anything to do with library schools. And we were like, tell her to look up Melville Dewey, inventor of the Dewey Decimal System. He was such a eugenicist, they even removed him from his job at Columbia. Our Dewey Decimal System is the product of an absolute eugenicist. And it's embodied in our Google searches as well, and in all of our search functions as well. So if we're really going to reform higher education, we also have to reform the categories. We have to really think about how you change the categories. As Safiya says, the monopoly of information is a threat to democracy, especially when that monopoly can be capitalized. When Google is not just doing ranked searches, they're selling their searches. That's why we've got 5,000 Filipino hackers being paid starvation wages in order to break into the haystack site. They want to change their SEO of the terms that they're being paid to have a more elevated page ranking. Since Haystack had such a sterling record, they want to have an ad on our site so it changes their Google ranking. Next slide, please. This is a marvelous little piece I just read. Published March 1st this month, by someone named William Lippman, who teaches at the California College of Arts, How I Found the Courage to Decolonize My Syllabus. He was teaching an architectural history class when everything went online, and his students were spread all over the world. So it was not making much sense to talk about the distinction between brutalism and modernism when he had students in Vietnam, in Singapore, in Shanghai, in Cuba, all over the world. So what he did was he had his students go out and find any building that they had access to as a public. So it could be a commercial establishment, a public building, a school, and he had them draw the building, and then he had them come back and talk about it and talk about who had occupied what place in that building and how the physical built environment reified the status hierarchy of the people who were either consuming or producing the product in that environment. He said it totally changes his view of art history. also made it impossible for people to cheat, because he had to change what the questions were. And he says, this is such a great thing. If the answer can and will be easily found using online sources, why are we asking these kinds of questions in the first place? Right? Why is that our closed book exam? Come on, we can do better. And he turned the experiential experience of these students all over the world during COVID into experiential tests that they made actually for each other, as well as for themselves, and became a different form of testing. Next slide, please. Another wonderful book, also by somebody who is involved in Haystack, called Urban Humanities. Actually, they were winners of a digital media and learning initiative. This is an incredible project where people remap the city of Los Angeles using collaborative mapping techniques, visualization platforms, community organizations, academic research, and citizens of Los Angeles reporting on what they see. For a while, there were those horrible little monitors on the back of buses that normally plague you with ads, had urban humanities mapping of the city of Los Angeles. So you could, as you were driving on a bus, a public city bus through the city of Los Angeles, your map in front of you would tell you the history of that particular place you were seeing out the window. That's what they used their grant for. To make those maps, they employed hundreds, maybe thousands of kids to write the maps of their city on a block by block, foot by foot, yard by yard level, working with programmers at UCLA, engineering students and art students at UCLA to make those little things on the back of the buses, which are discussed in this book, Urban Humanities. But it was absolutely the partnership that was the source of the creativity. Next slide, please. I like to do a thing where my students create my syllabus. The most radical one I ever did was my first year when I came from Duke to the City University of New York with far more fanfare than I deserved. And I was teaching a class with the former president of the Graduate Center, the person who'd been the acting interim chair, chancellor of the whole CUNY system. So two pretty famous people. We picked 14 students for the class. The requirement was they had to be from a different discipline. Each one had to be from a different discipline. They had to be currently teaching or directing a program at one of CUNY's 25 campuses, 275,000 full and 275 part-time students. The campuses are two-year campuses like Medgar Evers, which has an 8% completion rate. Actually, now it's up to 15%. But the poorest, students who are not working 40 hours a week, they're working 70 hours a week. They're the students who right now are on their bicycles at 3 in the morning, delivering goods to middle-class people, and they're in class at 9 o'clock the next morning. So Bill and I walked into this classroom. We said, we're teaching a class called Mapping the Future of Higher Education. We'll be back in 45 minutes. You 14 graduate students who are all teaching undergraduates, design a class that's going to change all our lives. And we left. You have to leave. If you're going to do this experiment with your students and have them design a syllabus, you have to leave. Otherwise, you have the groupthink effect that I described earlier. And they did it. The only thing we gave them was big, huge Post-it notes that had the timeline of the class worked out, because nobody can think creatively while they're also thinking, is that a Tuesday class or a Thursday class? Is it the spring break? So we had that mapped out. We made 4 groups, and the students made themselves in groups and invented a syllabus for us. That's the most radical time I've ever done it. But I still have students do that for half of a class. I might start at half of a class and students do the second half. They have never failed me. And they're so engaged because they're reading and doing things that they're passionate about, and they do the work. One of my favorite things was last year, a friend of mine was teaching a Black Studies class. She did this with her students. She and I co-direct transformative learning in the humanities for the CUNY system, Shelley Eversley. Her students said they wanted to read a book called Thick by Tressie McMillan Cottom. And Shelley said, I've never heard of it. And they said, it's just out, but we love it. You're going to love this book. So Shelley said, okay, we'll use this book. The next week, Tressie was given a MacArthur Genius Grant. So the students felt like they were the most brilliant people in the world. They took full credit for her winning a Genius Grant. It was quite wonderful. Next slide, please. My favorite quote, and then we're going to go into some do items, not just talk items, but do items. This is from Samuel Delany, the great science fiction novelist, genius science fiction novelist. He was an A+ student at Bronx School of Science, but he was gay and Black, and he ran to the West Village at age 18. And he wrote his first science fiction novel. At 20, He published his first science fiction novel, and he won the big science fiction novel award for that novel. He never went to college. He's famous for being one of the most educated people in America. He devours books. His books are really difficult to read, and he himself is incredibly well read, but he's always felt one down because he didn't go to college. At the age of 40, he was invited to come to Wesleyan University and teach a college course. When he talks about this in a movie about himself, it's very tiny Vimeo print on the bottom of this page. We can send you the URL later if you're interested in this movie about him. He says he prepared to teach this class the way he would to write a novel. He just was so prepared, and he ran into class and couldn't wait to ask a question because he thought all 30 students were going to just jump out of their seats to answer this question. That's what college is, he thought. He'd never been to college. This is what he was missing. He asked his question, 3 students raised their hand. Now, most educators know if you're in a class of 30 and 3 students shoot up their hand, we're so happy. We're so happy anyone answered. He weeps in the video when he talks about this experience, literally weeps. Here's what he says. Don't you realize that every time you don't answer a question, you're learning something? You're learning how to make do with what you got, and you're learning how not to ask for a raise. You're learning how to take it. That's not good. So from now on, whenever I ask a question, everybody's got to put their hand up. I don't care. I don't care whether you know the answer or not. You have to put your hand up. We need to teach people they are important enough to say what they have to say. If you go, Sam, he's retired now, but when he was teaching at Temple University, he did get a full-time teaching job at Temple near the end of his life, the last 10 years of his, not like he's still alive. Sorry, Samuel. At the last 10 years of his teaching, he would ask a question and everyone would raise their hand. What we know from cognitive neuroscience is that act of raising your hand says, I am here. He would then call on somebody and they would either answer the question or they'd say, sorry, Professor Delany, I don't know the answer, but I bet Adrian knows it, or I bet David knows it, or I bet Kim knows it, or, and you turn the question to somebody else and it becomes a kind of a game where you're all not trying to show who's smartest, who's prettier. You're not trying to show each other up, but you're all together trying to figure out the best ways, the most creative and interesting ways to answer a question. It's a brilliant, brilliant exercise. Next slide, please. I now use in all of my classes, and I'm currently finishing a book with somebody who just finished her PhD. It seems horrible for somebody at this stage in their career to write a book about how to teach. So I'm co-writing with a brand new PhD, an adjunct professor, because that's crucial. That perspective is in there. We're writing a book about all the different ways you can turn a one-to-many model of learning into a many-to-many model. The easiest techniques are like the one you did at the beginning of this lecture, which is called in education jargon an entry ticket. They're all called inventory methods. The American Psychological Association calls this total participation, of course, capital T, capital P. And it means techniques that solicit participation in higher order thinking from all participants at the same time and without judgment in a low stakes arena. No one loses anything by putting something into a chat. You're not graded on it. It's not going to prevent you from going to medical school. It's not going to prevent you from getting that consulting job at Kinsey, which insists that you have to have a higher than A average for reasons I don't understand, probably elitism. But the creative ways of everybody being involved. When I do a lecture, I've done it with 6,000 IB teachers in the Philadelphia 76ers arena. That was intense. On Jumbotrons, I could see everybody with their index cards. Everyone had a pencil and an index card we'd passed out in advance, and we did Think, Pair, Share. In Think, Pair, Share, you ask a very basic question and give everyone 60 seconds, maybe 90 seconds to write out an answer. It's really important that they write it out. In the pair section, people team up and one person reads what's on their card, nothing else, no idea hogs here. Read what's on their card, while the other person gets to listen. And then you switch. So it means everybody in the room, even 6,000 people in the 76ers auditorium, has at least one moment where they can hear themselves speak and hear them and also listen to one other person without judgment. Just hear, just listen. Interestingly, people who are cognitively challenged, I'm dyslexic, so this is very important in an area of research I've done a lot of work on. Many people who are afraid to speak in class or get tongue-tied or embarrassed in class can read to another person off a card. There's a cognitive thing that happens when you've written something down and are reading your own writing that makes it easier than the process, which is actually quite complex. We have lots of fMRIs that show what that process is of going from thinking an idea to actually articulating it in words. That's it's not an easy process. If you know anyone with dementia or senility or Alzheimer's, you know that that's one of the things that happens first, and that's a good sign of what a cognitive overload it is. So it's a very simple way of doing it. After they've shared and each read each other's card, then we give 90 seconds for them together to come up with one of them who will say something to the group that somehow represents both of them. We have so much research. Those 1,000 studies I talked about at the beginning of this lecture, 1,000 studies showing the efficacy of active learning, that shows that moment of synthesis where you've listened to somebody else, put it together, and you articulate it. And if somebody doesn't want to read it out loud, we do it in a Google Doc. There are many different ways that you can do this so people don't have to speak if they won't. That moment of synthesis is learning. Definitional, whatever that word is, that's when you're learning, is when you're synthesizing together things that don't quite fit, differences. At Haystack, we call that method collaboration by difference. You're looking at things that don't match and figuring out ways that you can make something positive from the mismatch. That's how learning happens. That's how creativity happens. It's an incredibly important attribute. In 2014, the publications of the National Academies of Science looked at over 225 separate science STEM studies of how we learn. Studies that were rigorously controlled in peer-reviewed journals to compare inventory learning to selective learning, either either lecture or discussion method. The results, the superiority of active participatory inventory learning, whatever jargon you want to use, were so great that the authors, many authors, there are like 6 different authors of the meta-study said, if this had been a pharmaceutical study, traditional learning would have been taken off the market. It was utterly unambiguous. It was best for the best students and for first generation new students, and especially good actually for first generation students who were new to education. Incredible results from those studies. And again, I think I've already sent those references if somebody wants to distribute those to students. Entry and exit tickets are very, very simple. When people come into a room, you just simply ask them to do something as simple as writing the keywords for their mission statements for transforming higher education. It automatically creates respect. Everybody has ideas. All the ideas are interesting. We actually don't have the same ideas. In groupthink, those 3 people seem like they're speaking for everyone. They're not. One of my students came up with a wonderful entry ticket idea where we were reading a 10-page article, and she said, what if in our entry ticket we each write down one sentence or phrase from the article we read together? Just one sentence, and then go around the room and everyone read their sentence. No commentary, just read the sentence. There were 30 of us in the room. We all thought we were reading the same 10 pages. No, we were reading different things. And that, we know this from Michel de Certeau's idea of poaching, that's how attention works, right? You pick the thing that is meaningful to you. You're not reading all 10 pages. You're reading selectively those things that make meaning for you. It's a wonderful exercise for seeing how different we are, and yet how, even when we have similar shared values, we have individual voices. It's great for creativity. Collaborative note-taking is something I do. Exit ticket is the same. Before people leave a classroom, you ask them some simple thing they write down. My friend, and I think he's a friend of Anne's as well, Jonathan Stern, who teaches media studies at McGill University, does this with 600 students in his Introduction to Media Studies class. He asks them one question. He has them sign their index cards and turn it in. The proctors for the discussion sections each take the tickets, and that's what they use to help the discussion sections, because they've got tickets randomly written. And that becomes the grounds for the discussion section. It's also a way of taking roll, so it's very efficient. The question he asked, that's my favorite. What question about media did we talk about? What did we talk about having to do with media that we talked about today that's going to keep you awake at night tonight? And if we came up with nothing that's going to still be in your head when you're trying to go to sleep tonight, we failed. So then write what we should have been talking about for today's topic. Because we're talking about media, that's pretty urgent. So if you aren't still thinking about it all day, something's wrong. What should we have been talking about? Incredible exercise. Collaborative note-taking is an exercise I've done when I've done big lectures where each row of the lecture hall gets a number, and sequentially, as I'm giving a lecture, students or the audience are taking notes together and annotating those notes and doing that in some collaborative form like a Google Doc. So I give a 40-minute lecture, and at the end of the lecture, there might be 200 pages of people collaboratively taking turns and filling in the notes, both about what I'm saying and their own ideas. People are amazing. They will put in references. Here's a study you might like. It turns into an incredible document, almost a book by the end of a class from this collaborative enterprise, and it enriches what the standard form, the one-way form of the lecture. Next slide, please. Bell Hooks says the classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy, but only if we equalize everybody in the room and everybody takes responsibility for participating and sharing knowledge. Next slide, please. Phew, finally, your turn. So we're going to use the Q&A feed again. Next slide, please. And this time you get not 60 seconds, but a whole 90 seconds. This is an activity you could use in any classroom. I want you to just share your own favorite activity for empowering all students or everybody in the room. It could be at a community meeting, it could be a project, it could be fellow students, it could be something a professor did in a class you took. If you're graduate students who are teaching other students, it could be that, it could be from anything you've come up with or experienced or heard about that empowers everybody at once to think more critically, to imagine, to be creative, to be activists. It could be a method, it could be a project, it could be an assignment, it can be a question, it can be anything at once. Doesn't have to be literate. Write it down in the Q&A field. You have 90 seconds this time, and then we'll look at all the answers together afterwards. 90 seconds, go for it. Be as creative, make it up. If you don't understand the instructions, make up something else. Just go for it. Be as creative as you can be. It's about 30 seconds left. Great. Do we have some interesting things in the chat, in the field? Can somebody make those public?
So I think 2 of the contributions are public now.
Excellent. Yes, and that's the improv, right? Isn't that what you do when you're doing improvisational comedy or improvisational acting? Somebody says something and then somebody answers yes and, not but, yes and then goes from there and takes it from there. That's an incredibly interesting creative writing prompt. All students have an opportunity to contribute to the making of a paper mache life-size crocodile. Whoa, can I take your class? That's amazing. This allows students to touch, feel, mix the flour and water, then use the newspaper strips to make a form on the wall. Whoa, that's incredible. I'd love to see one of your crocodiles sometimes. Curate exhibitions that surprise students by making them realize how much they have learned. That's great. Ask every student to write a letter with a pen on paper and then share it with the group. Most digital natives have never learned how to write a letter. I learned this from a brilliant A-Tech student. Wow, that's cool. I sometimes have students on the last day of class write a letter to students to be given to students on the next students who take that class, and they will read that letter on the first day of class. It's very moving. Students on the first day of class, when they read these letters from the students who've been before them, get very emotional about it. And so even when the letters are funny, it feels so personal. And the students who are leaving, it's a different kind of experience when they're summing up what they learned and what they're wishing for the future learners in a class. My professor said one day, when you found out exactly what you want, then find the greatest person in the room in the field to communicate with. Whoa, is that why I keep getting these letters from people I'm doing a paper on, and I would like, I get a lot of letters like that, and I try to answer them all. I actually think most people are happy to answer letters like that from somebody who really has tried something and then wants to write somebody who's known as an expert in the field. That's a great one. Practice active listening, having dyads reflect back what they heard to each other and analyze. Proactive listening dyads reflect what they hear to each other. That's a beautiful one. I've actually tried that. I'm very poor at it, but I love that practice of having someone tell you something, like for a minute or something, and then you tell back what you think you heard. It's very interesting because it's like telephone tag, except with two people. You often hear something very different than the person thinks they're saying, and often something very powerful comes out of that. In one of our listening dyads in the Futures Initiative, someone said, you said X, Y, and Z, but is something sad happening in your life? I heard something sad in your voice, and it turned out it was absolutely the case. It was very moving. Role-playing that people can think in others' shoes. That's fantastic. Role-playing is one of the most important inventory techniques. I picked this up from one of my professors here in ATAC, answering the why are you here question multiple times in a group pair discussion on the first day of class. Wow, that's powerful. I assume that every time you answer the why are you here, you've had time to reflect on other people saying why are you here, and the answer gets more and more intense and different each time. That's a beautiful one. That's a really beautiful one. I've started having students determine how they want to weight assignments, choose where to invest their energies. I do contract grading in almost all my classes, which is for another talk, but I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. Once took a class to a graveyard to greet Hal by Ginsberg. Whoa, then tell their secrets. That's amazing. Can we go with the crocodile? Ginsberg would love that if we took the crocodile to the graveyard. Those are amazing. And I hope each of you learned that you're all teachers. I know most of you are students. You're also teachers. We're all co-learners in this activity together. And the more we come up with ways that learning can be shared, the more creative the experience is. Next slide, please. This is just a silly slide. During the inauguration of President Biden, somebody tweeted, a professor tweeted, Dr. Jill Biden looking awfully calm for somebody with 4 syllabi to finalize this week. You may know that she's a community college teacher and she's refusing to give up her community college job while she's the first lady, first lady. Teaching is hard work. It was a great comment to make on academic teaching Twitter, because the inauguration is important, but teaching, now there is a hard job. And then my last slide is by last slide, please, from America's favorite recent graduate, Amanda Gorman, 23 years old, who got to read. What an inspiring thing, right? To have the poet laureate be somebody who just this spring graduated from college, and the last lines of her poem, for there's always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it. Last slide, please. Thank you. Thank you very much to everybody. I wish I could be there in the room and feel what you're feeling and feel the energy. But I believe there's time that Rashid and Kim are going to moderate and take some questions for us, also in the Q&A field. Rashid and Kim, I'll let you take over from here. I'm happy to answer questions about any of these methods, any of these ideas. And thank you all for your attention. I know in this zoomed out world, nobody needs another Zoom experience. So the fact that you're here already means you're one of the pioneers starting and building towards the future of education. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Davidson, for the wonderful talk and for all the important perspectives and techniques in regards to participatory and liberatory pedagogy in higher education. So as we wait for our audience to engage with the questions, I will go ahead and ask a question of my own. So So I'm just I'm wondering about the kind of relationship between educational leadership, as you said in your talk, right, regarding teachers, pedagogues, educational leaders, as you call them, and also like administrative and institutional leadership, right? Because in the higher education, it's not happening in a vacuum, and I'm wondering about the role of the institution in kind of reinforcing this idea of the future of higher ed that works for the top 100%, right?
Yes.
Because yes, we as teachers and pedagogues can reinforce these ideas, but at the same time, we do need institutional and kind of administrative support from the university. So what
Yes.
kind of role do you see them playing in this kind of paradigm shift, I would say?
So that's a
Thank you.
fantastic question. I really appreciate that because, again, our adage, you cannot change structural inequality with goodwill. You need new structures with equality at the core. The reason I talked about the pyramid of the research, teaching, service versus a more equitable service, a circle that turns service into leadership, is that's an administrative decision. That's not just that's a faculty decision, a faculty governance decision, but it's also an institutional decision that would require reshaping and rethinking the priorities of an institution. Now, you can be the president, you can be the chancellor of a university. You still are not free to make those decisions yourself because, as many of you know, every 5 years you have to do these god-awful, am I allowed to say that? I'm sorry, I take that back. That's not a proper thing to say. That was blasphemy, and I apologize to anyone here. That we have to do those tedious, is that a good synonym? Tedious accreditation. We're middle states. I don't know what your accreditation boards. These accreditation documents that are often more Taylorist and Fordist than anything Galton and Taylor came up with, right? They're body counts. They're the most primitive kinds of statistics. What is your graduation rate with no understanding of what is your rate of how many hours a week your students work? What is the income level? Those things are far more determinative of whether you graduate or not than education. Georgia State did the study of its own students and found out students were 7 times more likely to drop out of Georgia State, which is a heavy Pell supported institution, public institution, 7 times more likely to drop out of school because of financial reasons and educational reasons. So you then have a accrediting body that's going to determine whether you're doing your job or not by how many students graduate. That means how many rich students do you have? How many so the accreditation has to change, the values have to change, then institutions have to change, then the teaching and reward structures have to change. Then we're free to make change. On the other hand, I agree with Bell Hooks that the classroom is the most radical space for possibility. And even in an institution, so one of the things I do in my classes is we do institution mapping. When I teach undergraduates, especially when I'm teaching in the community college system here, I do workshops and classes all over the 25 CUNY campuses. I'll have students work together to see if they can come up with a map of the structure of the institution. They actually do a pretty darn good job. When they put their heads together, they know where HR sits. They know where research sits. They know where the counseling center sits. They know where their adjunct professors sit. They know where they sit, right? They're pretty smart about that. And then after they've done that map, I'll say, okay, here we are, the door is closed. The people at the top of of the diagrams you've just made, they're not in the room with us. We've already done something subversive in that you yourself know the power structure. You've put together all of your intelligence in this room, collaboratively, collectively, in 15 minutes. You have a key to the power structure. Do you know how important that is? Did you have that key 15 minutes ago? If that door were open and the president were standing outside, would you have that key? Think about that. I'm talking about students who come from the lowest income quartile. Some 70% of our students at many of our campuses in the CUNY system have family incomes of less than $18,000 a year in the city of New York. That's family of 4. That's almost unimaginable, right? They suddenly have the key to an institution. I'll then often when I leave say, okay, next class, close the door and see if you can make the same map for the city of New York, right? You have a key. That key is a tool. I don't care what the content is you're learning, you're also learning how to learn, and that's a key, and that's a tool, that's empowering. So even in the most repressed situations of policing, and I'm using that word very carefully now, unlike the other word that I apologize for, this I'm using in a very specific way, in the forms of surveillance, institutionalized forms of surveillance that we use to keep people in a certain kind of relationship to authority. Even in the most constrained situations, we can find ways to give people keys that are life-changing. And that to me is why I'm focusing on pedagogy now. I'm doing this thing called the How We Know trilogy. And the first book was How the Brain Works. I really needed to understand how we learn how to be immigrants. How do we learn how to be people of color? How we learn how to be women? How we learn how to be smart? How do we learn to be dyslexic? My own particular thing that I had to learn as a child. Where do we learn that? The second book was How We Change Education, the new education. I'm now writing the new classroom, which is what we can do, even in the limited circumstances we have. And it's very concrete in the way the last part of this talk was, with exercises you can do, how you make a map of your university, how you give students the key, and what that key can open, what doors that key can open for the rest of their lives. Many of our students, if you're riding your bicycle at 3 in the morning to deliver goods to people who are rich enough to pay you to deliver goods to their house during a pandemic, you don't know that you have a key to how institutions work, right? That's an amazing, amazing key. Yes.
So we're starting to get some questions in from the chat, and I'm just going to read this one verbatim because I think it's a great phrasing. What advice, or no, excuse me, how can we reduce anxiety in students who are scared by different educational experiences that they are not used to, and they're afraid that they're not learning the right things?
So the first thing is to acknowledge they're correct to be afraid. They are using their brains. They're using their reasoning, they're using their experiences in the world to accurately say, my grade counts, right? They wouldn't be at the University of Texas at Dallas if their grades didn't count, right? They wouldn't be going to medical school or nursing school or audiology school or any professional postgraduate training if they didn't have grades. They know that's true. So the first thing is to affirm their reality. It counts. On the other hand, we have over 1,000 studies of active learning, and some of those studies are about student resistance to active learning. And those studies have found that the single best thing you can do, it's like the key to the institutions, is give them the key to the knowledge. Show them the studies that shows that in fact in active learning, things they think are wasting their time because they've been taught only to prize the person at the front of the room. 80% of students graduate even from universities with small classes of under 20 students, knowing this name of the professor and not another name of anyone in the class unless they happen to know them in a social situation. Because we know who the important person is. The only name we have to know is our professor's name, right? If you give them the key and tell them that actually what looks like it's not useful learning from your peers, what you find frustrating, project-based learning, collaborative learning, which we do, that's another talk I could give on how terrible we are at managing projects. No one in the industry would allow you to do projects where you just say, get in your groups and do something. What? That's terrible. That's guaranteeing failure, right? Unless you're doing something creative like building a crocodile. Maybe that you could do in that way. But if you show them the studies, and show students that in fact they even do better on standardized tests, on all those standardized tests when they learn in these ways, then they're much more receptive to active learning. But the most important thing is giving credit to their fears, because those fears mean they've succeeded educationally. They've learned the system educationally. They just haven't learned that there's a better system that we're all afraid of. Great question, thank you. The reason I love that meta study of the 225 studies is it lays it all out. You want standardized tests in physics, here's a study. You want short answer tests in biology, here. You want lab results, here's a study. I mean, it really just is a roadmap to 225 STEM studies, every imaginable kind of metric.
I have another question from the chat, which is, what advice do you have for untenured faculty who I think often feel the most vulnerable? Oops, somebody published it and now I lost the text of it. Hang on. Thank you, helper. Who are trying to take on teaching and transforming as the biggest parts of their role, while also trying to publish enough to achieve tenure. And particularly there's like OER resources and things like that that aren't seen as tenure worthy, that we would connect as important to these causes of the top 100%.
So step 1, close the door. Step 2, active learning doesn't have to take more time than traditional learning. I mean, I know people who spend hours and hours and hours fretting over giving a slight variation of a lecture that they've given before. That also takes time. Also, what we know from how attention works is if you love something and enjoy it, it doesn't feel like it's taking as much time, right? If you're doing some drudgery that you can't stand and that you feel a little ashamed of, and you know you're leaving students behind, and you know you're going to get crappy teacher, oh, I did it again. You know you're going to get terrible teaching evaluations. That's enervating. That saps your creativity, and I believe reduces your productivity in your research. If you're excited and you can find ways to teach something analogous to, or some part of something that ties into your research, and your students are crazy for it and coming up with great ideas, I think that's the single best thing you can do to spur your own research. Maybe because of COVID and the pandemic and living in a one-room apartment for a year, I might think boredom is one of the things. Having too much time on your hands and being bored, or being dispirited, or being afraid, all of which are part of a pandemic. It's not just boredom, it's afraid you're going to run into somebody who's going to give you COVID the rest of you, and you're going to be a long hauler and your whole life is over, right? All of those things are the things that keep you from being productive. The other thing is, I think the single biggest reason people have academics have a hard time publishing is they're far too censorious about themselves. Anyone who's had a hard time writing an article, because I also do workshops on writing, because I tend to be a little bit compulsive and I do too much writing. I throw away hundreds of pages. I mean, I'm unpublished novels, and 6 of them in the Duke archives. I'm writing science fiction now. It'll never be published. I just love to write. It's my thing. But when people are stalled, and I get stalled all the time, I'll say, how many times did you write your first paragraph? It's usually, I'm seeing some nodding heads. I bet if we were all there, right? Right? There's a kind of hesitation, a fear. It's not good enough. We can't write that second paragraph because the first one isn't perfect. And we rewrite it like 75 times. It doesn't get better on the 76th time. It does not get better on the 76th time. But I think when you do inventory methods and you see the plethora of amazingness coming out of your students, it also gives you, and I like to do the exercises with my students too, but it also gives you a sense that you're part of a community of people thinking ideas together. You're not just the bottom of this situation that Rashid talked about that goes all the way to the president or the chancellor. You're part of a community that cares about ideas, that's trying to make worthwhile, inspiring ideas. And you know, because you've got colleagues together. I've taken in, on the 73rd time, taken in that paragraph to my students and read it to my students and said, would you help me revise this? Put it in a Google Doc and said, if I put you in groups, would you help revise this? It'll help you too with your final papers. First of all, it really helps them with the final papers. They're like Davidson with all those books, and she's on the 73rd time writing or 74th time writing her introduction. She does that too. So that's great in terms of being an equalizer. Inevitably, someone says, this sentence in the middle here, this weird sentence, if you take the last 3 words of it and the first 4 words of that, you've got your opening sentence, and that's an article I want to read. This try number 73 is boring, but whoa, there's a nugget there, right? It's about sharing knowledge and being a community of learners and a community of institutional leaders and creators and designers. I know that sounds optimistic, but I've been reading Bruce Mao, and as he says, when things are a disaster, that's when designers get to work, right? Yay, things are a mess, we can redesign. I didn't talk about this. Mariana Mazzucata, the brilliant economist, says we should not be thinking about the future beyond 2023. We need to be thinking about 2023 when the fear, the boredom, the anxiety, the isolation, the terror, the dispiritedness that we're all feeling now in the pandemic, it's still rich in our hearts. And we don't want that for our future. Nor do we want what happened before March of 2020. That wasn't so great. We all complained about it then. We got something bigger to complain about now, but we complained about March 2020, right? So what can we do in March 2023 that learns from this horrific worldwide, going down in history catastrophe that we're in now? I taught a bunch of 6-year-olds, actually they were the kids of the students I was teaching. We brought out, because so many women were in my class with their little kid on their lap. So I said, okay, this is going to be a class for the little ones. We taught a class of little ones, and I made the parents go away, and I said, you know, when you're 90 or 30, they don't know the difference, you're still going to be telling people about what you went through, that you were 4 years old and 5 years old and you made it through the pandemic. You're heroes. When you have grandchildren, you're still going to be telling your grandchildren, when I was 5 years old, right? You've got something. People are going to be writing history books about your life, about what you lived through. It was amazing what it did for them in terms of giving them a perspective that they weren't failing. They all felt they were falling behind. These little tiny kids, preschoolers, felt like they were falling behind. Suddenly they were like, no, we're not falling behind. We're leaders. We're making history. And I think that, I don't remember what this question was, but somehow it tied together. Remember what we're going through now and use it in the future.
Can I jump in and ask a question? It didn't come up in the, so it's a selfish question, and it's about, it's about taking the insights and the large enrollment lecture class.
Yes.
So selfish because that's my stake in the ground in terms of teaching in ATEC at the undergraduate level.
Sure.
And so, one thing that I'm hearing is that there are techniques, no matter kind of what your scale. And I just want to ask about ideas about overcoming architecture.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm going to toss that to you. Overcoming architecture.
So first of all, you've got to go to Jonathan Stern's blog about teaching 400 or 600 students, because he has so many wonderful ideas. He does this incredible thing where he lets people, and he always tells, he's very prescriptive, talk about a design thing about the size. So say you can only write on something this size and only be on one side, but you can write any notes you want. That'll be your crib sheet for the exam. And then he does art exhibits of the way people organize knowledge. And what he knows is his stupid ABCD multiple choice exam, which he has to do because he's got too many students. That's not where students learn. The learning happens. It's like think, pair, share in the synthesizing to put things on that sheet. So you don't really care if the exam's dorky and it's not really about learning. And we know it's not about learning. We've got the research on that. What's the learning is synthesizing all of that and figuring out how your brain works to communicate and help yourself in a crisis. That's another life skill. It's like the key to the institution. It's a life skill. I love and he's got a million things like that. He's got so many interesting things like that, and he writes about them very eloquently. So I highly recommend his blog. I think it's called Superbone, B-O-N. He teaches I love to have one class term when I'm doing a big lecture where I tell students to rearrange the room. And the institutional constraint is we have to put it back again. And I give them warning. So like next class is the class where we redo the architecture. Bring anything to the class you need, but it can't be permanent. So if you bring markers, they can't be permanent because you're going to clean up the room. And if we have to stay here till midnight, you're going to clean up the room. Bring anything you want that you think will transform the room. And then I spend half the class with people going crazy, building that crocodile. And then the other half talking about what they did. And often I'm going back to what I talked about with Rashid, doing a map where I have students then do a map of the room. Usually I do that the week before, where they do a map of the existing room And I do it like that's hokey, our town thing. Here's me at my desk, in this row, in this room, in this building, at this university, in this state, in this country, on this planet, you know, so they have to situate themselves. Then they make a map of their then they bring in crazy materials and make a new thing, disposable, retractable, all of those words. And then I have them do a map. Before they take it down, I have them do a map of what they were trying to do in that room. Why did you want to make a crocodile have in that room? Wow. What does that do if one of our classmates is a paper mache crocodile? That's cool, right? What are you telling us about the room if there's a paper mache crocodile in it? Or blankets, or inner tubes, because people want to pretend they're under the water. I mean, people bring in all kinds of things. I'm trying to think in, I had students bring in a little pup tent, like one of those little, like a 2-person tent, because they hated feeling so exposed sitting in a classroom with all those other students and feeling that close to other students. That's powerful, right? You learn things. We know that. You're A-Tech. So you know.
I'm so excited because I mean, Rashid, you're probably going to be amused by this, but can you imagine? I mean, I'm going to try it in the fall. Imagine, I mean, the architecture that I have to work with, or we have to work with our large lecture, is an auditorium designed.
I remember.
Right, designed for
performance.
Curtain, but you know, inner tubes, pump tent. I mean, that. Again, not permanent. They can't unscrew the seats that are in the 30 row, you know, the 30, seat
right.
rows. But you could inhabit those seats differently.
Yeah. Well, my friend Denise Cruz, who used to teach at the University of Toronto, in exactly that room, 450 students in that room, now teaches at Columbia, and she's been online, and she's got great things that she's doing online. But she used to do, one time she had students bring, because they're in a room with no windows too, it's not a turning room, she had them bring rave sticks, and she turned off the lights and had them do the whole class as a rave. She would call out comments and then they would respond. She said, I mean, she would just do crazy things, purpose, and then the meta, then the reflection. What did we just do? Right? What did it do to
the rave?
what did we do by turning out the lights? Whoa! How did it feel? She on this semester at Columbia, she's associate professor, but she has to go through the tenure process at Columbia. So friggin' brave. She's online. She's teaching Asian American studies. First of all, she made a beautiful video to invite people into the class, saying this is a semester like no other. No, redo. This is a semester like no other. I mean, she made it, we're going to get through this together. We're going to inspire each other. She told her students she was learning how to play the guitar as her COVID thing. We all, some people buy puppies. I've been learning drumming. We all have some thing. Hers was learning to play the guitar. She first said everybody had to come to the class wearing their PJs, modest. She came in flannel pajamas. She's up for tenure at Columbia. She moved her whole family to New York and has to go through tenure. She came in her flannel PJs, got out her guitar, and played them a pop song, something about being 21, which I can't remember the name of, but every student, do you know what it is, Rashid? Do you know the student? I think it's called At 21, or anyway. It's an indie rock song. She played it on her guitar. Not well. Average voice, below average guitar skills. And then she said, what are you going to do for your research papers? I'm here, first year at Columbia, going to be evaluated by peers at Columbia in my flannel pajamas playing the guitar. I'm playing the guitar and singing the song. What are you going to do for your research paper? Whoa, they were amazing. I mean, she's one of the people I'm profiling you in our book, and she's one of the people I profile in the book as well, because that's amazing. But partly that's going back to your thing, Rashid, what can institutions do? That's a lot of institutions she was bucking to do what she did. I would not have been that brave. I might have sworn in class, that's true, but I'm not brave, wouldn't have been brave enough to be in flannel pajamas. Plus, that's not even a skill, that's just a problem. But she was in her pajamas, flannel pajamas, playing a guitar she'd learned during COVID. That's setting a high bar for learning.
Thank you. That was, again, a kind of very personal, selfish question, self-interested question.
All questions, if they're good, are self-interested.
True, exactly. So I know we're after the 4 o'clock kind of hour, but Kim, you said you might have had a question, or Rashid.
This might be a good closing question, which is, I mean, I think that we're all, I think that talking about how much we hate online teaching is the new talking about the weather.
Yes.
Right? Yes. So I'm wondering if there is anything that you see as a positive development in sort of what I'm calling pandemic pedagogy.
Yes.
That you hope will carry forward after we sort of return to in-person teaching.
Thank you. So first of all, we're not doing online learning. We're doing emergency remote education. Right. There's nothing about these systems that are designed. We haven't been trained for online learning. We've got 25 years of excellent research on what is efficacious for online learning. No one gave us time to learn that. We had a week to put 18 million students online. Right. I mean, and we're all flying by the seat of our pants at the same time that we've got kids home from school, parents we're taking care of, not able to take care of everyday life. Everything goes, terrible bandwidth. People jackhammering their building on floor 7 when you live on floor 9. I mean, this is everyday life. This is an emergency. So we're making history, as I told the 5-year-olds, we're making history. We will be in the history books with the polio epidemics, with the Black Plague, with, all of those things, bubonic plague, all of those things in the past. And we have terrible tools. So we're doing our best. Even still, we're finding things. Students of color are reporting they feel less discrimination in their blacked out screens with white words than they feel when they are visible in a classroom. And we've got, I've heard 2 preliminary papers on that. They're quite extensive, with people feeling if they make a comment online where they're not seen, they are, you have to be a person of color or a woman in that situation. You have to be the victim of a microaggression even to see a microaggression. So these are not, they have to be self-reporting. But these are people saying the kind of microaggressions I feel when I say a comment and the teacher looks the other way, and then Karen next to me makes the same comment and the teacher says, oh, that's smart, or not, or John makes the same comment. You say, woo, what a smart comment. Those kind of microaggressions are happening less, according to the self-reports and studies. I'm not sure if either of them has been published yet, but I know there's 2 very extensive ones that are happening across all kinds of institutions. So that's one of those things that Mariana Mazzucato says we have to remember in 2023, that we don't perceive the microaggressions that we are perpetrating in our classrooms, but they're there. And because we don't see them doesn't mean they're not being seen, right? So that's one. Another one is students with cognitive and physical disabilities say that the shame level is much less intense online. And that's fascinating to me for a different reason. Besides drumming, my pandemic thing is TikTok. I'm insane for TikTok. I'm on TikTok a lot and I love it. I'm a horrible creator. I'm getting a little better, but I'm still a horrible creator, but I'm trying. I may try to publish our book on TikTok. I don't know if Harvard likes that idea. Harvard University Press may not like me publishing the book on TikTok, but I would love to do it on TikTok. But so many people who have cognitive and physical disabilities go on TikTok, their face right into the camera to show you that half their face has been scarred in a fire, and take questions on, not rude questions. If someone's rude, the etiquette of TikTok is you call them out. Look at what some idiot wrote in the comments, and then everyone piles on and hates the hater, right? Because TikTok's community pledge is community. Whether it happens or not is a different thing, but people call, you know, if you get 700 comments and one bad one, you put that bad one up there and you're going to rake that person over the coals. But people who are deformed by an accident or a fire or scarring or something terrible that's happened to them will talk about what it feels like and what it means. There's somebody I follow on TikTok who had cancer. Actually, it wasn't cancer, another disease in his legs, and his legs have been cut off literally to his to his hip joint. So I know he can still go to the bathroom. I know he can still function sexually, and he walks on his hands, and he has to have special furniture made, special things going to bus because he's a full-size man, a large man, and his body ends at his hip joint. I mean, he tells me that as one of his followers on TikTok. That's amazing. So there's something about the anonymity of distance and technology that also can allow people, if in the right community, to express themselves. I don't want to lose that in 2023. You know, so there are good things, but most of us are evaluating our online experiences both from a utopian perspective, and it isn't. It's remote, and it's a disaster, and it's an emergency, and we're all afraid, right? With reason. Yeah. And we're analyzing from the point of view of top-down hierarchical thinking of, I can't do my same old thing. Well, good. Maybe that's the point. Maybe that's the message. If we're going to have a morality play out of this pandemic, maybe the morality play is, we shouldn't be doing our same old things. We've been through a tragedy together. Over 500,000 people have died. How many people have lost loved ones this year? We have to learn something from it. We have to. Maybe that's it. We can't have business as usual in 2023.
Oh, Cathy, thank you. Thank you so much. I know all the hearts are
I wish I could see everybody. That is
for
me the sadness of one way. It's my sadness in my classrooms too, if I don't feel like I'm seeing my students.
So thank you for taking time to be with us. Thank you for taking time to give us a time to be with your passion and with your kind of stories and kind of the narrative that you've kind of helped put together that makes sense of things that are kind of can seem sometimes disparate. So on behalf of everybody here, I want to say thank you very much. And thank you to Dr. Knight, thank you to Rashid, thank you to Adrian, thank you to David Budd, thank you to Adam Buckscamper, thank you to Ellen, I see you there. Thank you everyone for a really successful kind of Teams Live event as part of this series. And then let me remind everyone that we actually don't have another event until April 9th. So there won't be additional Dean's Colloquiums because we're now clustering several of them also in April. And our next speaker, Cathy, you know this person. Our next speaker is Dr. Andy Van Dam, who is going to give us, an equally, I think, sweeping kind of how did we get here, hypertext to, kind of the infrastructures of kind of our information monopolies. And he promises he's going to end on a rant about how things have gone wrong. And if there's anyone who could say there were choices we could have made to do something different, but instead that choice led to this. So there's just a beautiful trajectory.
Great.
From Bruce to your talk to Andy. So thank you, everyone. If everybody who was on the kind of pre-live event, if you would just stay on, we're going to end the live event and say goodbye to all our kind of participants. And thank you very much for all your questions and kind of your presence. Okay.
Thank you for being here, everyone. Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay. Bye.